can I keep from singing your praise? How can I ever say enough? How amazing is your love? How can I keep from shouting your name? I know I am loved by the King, and it makes my heart want to sing.
Is there grace in the story of Joseph? A story about a young man sold into slavery by his own brothers, falsely accused of a hideous crime for which he was imprisoned? That's what we're about to learn from Robin Dunaway, an enrollment and advancement representative at Heritage Christian University, who shows us that the story of Joseph is an illustration of God's grace.
Thank you for being with us for the Berean series. We're happy that you have chosen to be a part of this. Our theme this year is Visions of Grace, and I think perhaps maybe one of the greatest stories in the Old Testament is the story of Joseph, who in some sense has this vision of grace from an early age, and he's able to carry out his mission, although unclear to him at times, but always with integrity and with obedience. And those things, I think, are key to help our personal visions of grace. First of all, I want to discuss with you about a vision. And they say that there are two kinds of people in the world. Those who live for the here and now, and those who live for the future or plan for the future, but still are able to live in the here and now. I think that Joseph is the one who has the ability to live in the here and now, but know that there's a bigger picture. Joseph's brothers, on the other hand, are the epitome of those who live for the here and now. And so as we look in on Joseph's story, we're going to get to see some things early on in Joseph's life that I believe are very key to what makes Joseph successful, what makes him able to serve, and what ultimately helps him to save his people. As we look into it in the book of Genesis, right back in the beginning in verse 37, we get to see in some part the foundation for Joseph's ability to have this vision. And in the passage beginning in verse 2, this is the account of Jacob. Joseph, it says, a young man of 17 was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about the brothers. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he had made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. And so, in essence, what you're beginning to see is this love that Joseph has for his father and the love that the father has for Joseph. On the other hand, the brothers who recognize this are totally not fine with it. And so, thus the story begins in terms of Joseph and his visions of grace. Now, I think what's interesting here in terms of Joseph's ability to have the vision, it's not just a blind vision, but Joseph gets the ability and the presence of mind to see what God's vision for him was. And so, beginning in verse 5 of chapter 37, it said Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood up right while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed to it." His brothers said, "Do you intend to reign over us will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Now, many times you and I have the same ability. This dream was given as a sort of an indicator of what the future would be. While Joseph took it to heart, his brothers were angry about it. Now you think about this in terms of our modern day. You see, we have a difficulty sometimes to seeing down the road. In fact, in some ways, we kind of approach God at times, and I want to be careful of how I say this, but sometimes we say, God, what have you done for me today? Rather than recognizing that there's a time coming when we will be living in a land of milk and honey when we're found faithful in Jesus Christ. But somehow we begin to lose sight of that. And we begin to live for, God, you need to bless me today, not in the eternity. Well, Joseph gets the dream, and it allows him some sort of a vision. Now, like I said, he doesn't always know exactly what this vision means, and we'll find that out as this story unfolds. But what is noteworthy is that he always keeps the vision in the forefront. Even though the here and now is happening, the vision is there. Now, in that same way, when we talk about grace, I want us to recognize something about grace that is very, very important. It is rooted in forgiveness and integrity. And so when we understand that those two things are paramount for grace, then we recognize that in some way our vision has to do with our obedience and integrity. And the integrity, if I can oversimplify that word, means doing the right thing no matter who's looking. And so when we talk about this next portion of the story, we're going to see some integrity lacking in the brothers, but yet Joseph, his integrity and obedience is in place. Now, I want to also mention this double story here because there's going to be a second part of this dream that is going to reinforce the vision. And so in verse 9 of chapter 37, it says, Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. When he told his father as well and his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, What is this dream you've had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, and his father kept the matter in mind. And so now he gets a second dose of the vision that's coming. And so when we talk about living, the difference between living in the here and now and whether or not we're going to understand that there's a future, then we understand that sometimes we get that glimpse, and whether we take it to heart or not is another matter. In the story, obviously Joseph is taking it to heart. On the other hand, his brothers are fighting against it. And even though his father rebukes him, notice that he says, it's tacked up in my heart. I've kept it on board. And so in the scheme of the Joseph story, we're going to see it unfold a little bit so that what happens to the here and now versus what happens in the future also makes a difference in our vision of grace. And so let's read further. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them. Very well, he replied, and I want you to note the obedience there for Joseph. And then he says, when Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the field and asked him, What are you looking for? He replied, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me they are supposed to be grazing their flocks? Now, in the scheme of obedience, Joseph has done exactly what he's supposed to do. In the other sense, with the brothers, they were told to go to Shechem, but yet when he arrives there, they're not there. So the integrity of the brothers who tend to live for the here and now are in question as we look at things. And so he says, no, they've moved on from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. And so Joseph shows up in Dothan, and sure enough, he finds the brothers. And what we already know about those brothers is they're already angry with him because he is the favored one. And then to add to that, they've received this vision. Now remember, when I say they, Joseph received the vision, but they got to be privy to it. So did they take it to heart, or did they harden their heart to that story? And of course, the obvious answer is they've hardened their heart. So when Joseph shows on the scene, now the brothers are planning to do away with him. Look, in terms of what's right and wrong, I want you to think about this. As you're traveling down the highway, and I want to be very cautious about this because I'm not making an indictment here, but if the speed limit is 70 and you're doing 70, guess what? The policeman is your best friend. On the other hand, if you're doing 80 and you're supposed to be doing 70, the other side of that coin is now the policeman becomes your worst enemy in a sense, because he can now call you into account for disobeying the law. That's the way the Joseph brothers saw Joseph. They recognized that what they've done was wrong, and Joseph is not going to be their friend here. Not that he doesn't love his brothers, but that he will call them into account. Dad told you to do this, but yet you're doing this. And so they begin to plot against him. And of course, as we unfold the story, you remember that he throws, the brothers throw Joseph down into the pit or the well. In terms of what they were trying to accomplish, they wanted to kill him. On the other hand, Reuben comes and he says, you know what, I don't want to kill him. So we need to rethink this. And I'm paraphrasing at this point. But what I want us to also see is that in the process, their goal, because of the here and now, is to do away with Joseph. They have no idea that down the road, they're going to be counting on Joseph to save their lives. Now, you could maybe say that they don't know the end of the story, and to that is true. Also, Joseph doesn't know the end of the story, but I will assure you that they have gotten the word through these dreams that there is something else coming. Now remember, I want to refer back to the two different people. Those who have the vision and those who live for the here and now. And so we're going to see the clear distinction between the two. Now, of course, Joseph is thrown down the well. They wind up deciding not to kill him, but they take that special coat that he was made and dip it in blood and take it back to their father and say Joseph is dead, but yet sell Joseph into slavery as he is on trek to Egypt. And so when we think about Joseph in these ways, I want you to note that in the vision, I don't know that Joseph always had the understanding of what the end result was, but I believe that he saw there was a bigger picture, and we'll talk further about that as we go down the line. So I want just to recap. Remember, Joseph is the one with integrity and obedience. He has vision, while the brothers have no integrity, and they are sinful in a sense, if you look at it right. They're falling short of the mark that the Father set for them. And so you see these two clear distinctions, and I always have to ask myself, which one of those folks am I? Would I be Joseph, or would I be the brothers? And I think that's part of the whole picture as we begin to unfold this story some more. So without going through a lot of details, what we find out is eventually Joseph is sold into slavery into Egypt. And in chapter 39, we're going to look at a couple of verses there. Chapter 39, beginning in verse 1, it says, Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of the Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes, and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of the household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of the household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. And so he left Joseph's care and in everything that he had, with Joseph in charge. He did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. What an amazing story. When you think about what Joseph was able to accomplish through God for Potiphar, and the success that only could be given, in a sense, you could say, to Joseph, but more importantly, that God would bless him in everything that he did. If there was ever a time of reinforcement, and I want to say this sincerely to you and I, most of the time we can look back and see where God was taking care of us, even when we didn't have the vision. For whatever the purpose, I want you to understand something about human nature. We generally get all of the signs that we need. We don't always interpret them properly. And so I want to challenge us to think in this way. We have begun to begin to live in the here and now, but recognize that there is a future. We live now, but plan for that future. And whatever you can say about Joseph, his obedience and his integrity and God being with him is going to serve him in a bigger way. And that's what we have to challenge ourselves to think of. You and I today have some similar thoughts. We've got the vision of heaven, even because of the resurrection. But I can tell you, people in general, even though sometimes they know that heaven is coming, they want a little heaven here on earth. In fact, sometimes we do so well that we begin to stay in the sort of the forefront of living like we're staying rather than like we're going. And so we want to challenge ourselves to understand this bigger vision. When we think about Potiphar in Joseph being in his household and everything that Potiphar did, we also recognize that there's an issue at Potiphar's house, and it's really out of Joseph's control once again. Remember, it was kind of out of his control with his brothers, even though his obedience and integrity was intact. Now he's in a similar situation with Potiphar's wife. He's a young man, a good-looking man, and Potiphar's wife sort of sets her vision on him. Now notice, she's got the here and now in place. And so Joseph, with his integrity, wards off Potiphar's wife. As we understand the story, I want you to also recognize that Joseph in some way is really, with his integrity intact, ready to get away from the situation. In fact, Potiphar's wife wants to take advantage of him. And when Joseph says, no thank you, it causes him pain, not because of what he's done for himself, but because Potiphar's wife is so put out with him that she creates a lie to get him in trouble. And of course, he goes to prison after that. And in the bigger sense, we see a huge problem with Joseph having to bear the burden of Potiphar's wife's lie. And so we feel for him. But yet his vision and integrity is never out of place. Even when he's in prison, the Lord blesses him. And the prison guard now puts him in charge. What an amazing story to even think about. And so, without going into much detail, I want to get to the bigger picture as we begin to wind up this lesson. I want you to see some things that are important, because in the scheme of things, those dreams that created the vision for Joseph, now is coming to full fruit because there's a famine in the land, and Joseph is allowed to be let out of prison. He interprets another dream. Remember, he gives God the credit for that interpretation. But I want us to note something here once again. In chapter 45, we see that the famine is in full-blown session, and some of the brothers have come to Egypt hearing that they have grain, having no idea that it has to do with Joseph. And so I want us to get a picture down here. If you do not have vision and you're living for the here and now, when Joseph sees his brothers coming for the grain, he could do one of two things. He can either challenge them and have them put to death, or he can accept them and pull them in. And so I want us to look at chapter 45, beginning in verse 1, because the action here with this vision of grace, or this idea of forgiveness and integrity, it begins this way. Then Joseph could no longer control himself. He sees the brothers. All of the emotions are running. These are the guys that tried to kill him first, then sells him into slavery. He goes through all this in prison, but yet finally he's in charge of Egypt. In a similar way that he was in charge in Potiphar's house, he now is the Pharaoh's right-hand man. And all that goes down in Egypt comes through Joseph. What an amazing story. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all of his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and the Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Now, can you imagine being in the presence of the guy that you thought you did away with? Yes, I think that translates well. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, and he had said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt, and now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be not plowing and reaping, but God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth to save your lives by a great deliverance." What a tremendous, tremendous meeting. If Joseph would have been living in the here and now, he would have done away with these brothers because he recognized now the vision, if you will, and understanding the importance. Then you can see for what it's worth that Joseph is making do exactly what God meant to happen. And as you tuck these things in your heart, you understand a couple of things, I think. And that is Joseph had a vision of grace. Now, the brothers are not convinced. While they've been treated well and while they've been brought in and they've been fed and they've been cleaned up and everything is wonderful, they've been given the land of Goshen to live in, you would think that that would be enough. But sometimes people who live in the here and now get a misinterpretation, a problem. And so I want us to look at the latter part of chapter 50 of Genesis, beginning in verse 15. When Joseph's father dies, the brothers are worried that he's going to hold a grudge. And so in this story, it begins in verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they have committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of God, of your father." When their message came to Joseph, he wept. Rightfully so. Listen to what he says, though. This is the key account. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves." But Joseph said to him, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended harm to me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. so that don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured him and spoke kindly to them. See, that's the vision of grace. You see, it is no different with Jesus Christ today. While he could hold grudges against those who have sinned against him, because of the resurrection, because of the blood of Christ, Jesus, even while he's on the cross, says, "Forgive them, they know not what they do." There's a bigger picture in salvation. If we can get that vision of grace, I promise that when we have the vision and we recognize that we live now, but we have the future ahead of us, we can be the great leaders in the kingdom that share the message that forgiveness is at hand, that grace abounds. And so our challenge is to get that message out. I pray that this has helped you in your vision of grace.
There is an endless song echoes in my soul. I hear the music ring, and though the storms may come, I am holding on, and to the rock I